I'm gonna share my screen, so please let me know if you can see it.
Yep, I can see
Yeah.
it.
Okay, great. Okay. Well, thanks, Michelle. And thank you everyone for joining today. We are going to talk about the Resilient South Norwalk project, the Resilient Corridor Analysis. Last time we met all together, I think was the end of April. Actually, I think it was like the 25th. And our team is here. Sorry, there we go. The AECOM team is here. I am Lorraine Black. I am the project manager for the project. And we have Jeffrey Morrison Logan and also Ellie Peterson from AECOM. And we have also joined today by Susan Bemis and I believe Chris Henry from FHI. They are working with us on the project, and John Trzynski and David Murphy with Circa.
Hey, everyone.
Great. So again, thank you very much. We're really looking forward to having a great discussion today. I'm going to go over a few things and then we'll have, like, I'm hoping about half, if not more, of our time together to have discussions about our next steps. So just giving a quick project update, we've completed the present and future conditions analysis for the report. And we've also completed a public workshop, the second one, which was on June 29th. And so today, our next step is to start looking at the adaptation options and concepts. And so our big goal today for everybody on the line is to talk about the main goals to get feedback for our priorities for the report. So we'll go over the project update and then we'll talk about milestones and action items. So just to give as I mentioned, we had the workshop with the public, and we came away with a few comments that were discussed. It seemed that the topics that the public were interested in were they supported planting of trees. They were concerned about toxic waste within the flood zones. So we're going to be reviewing that to see what's in the public domain and make sure we incorporate that in the report. There was an invitation for us to come and the team to come and walk the site and talk about some of the chronic flood areas. And so we're going to reach out to some of the residents and set up a time. And then the last issue that the public were concerned about was development density. And that's not really part of this scope, but we'll certainly take that into consideration as we look at everything. And so let's just kind of talk about the next steps. We're looking at completing the final report. We're going to be giving the city this report. It's going to have a lot of direction, an implementable roadmap with some recommendations to address flood and heat within the project area, which is highlighted on the left in this map, just to remind everyone, since it's been a little bit of time since we looked at these maps. We're really in the process of looking at one or two options. We've come up with a number of adaptation options, and we've kind of refined that list. And now we're looking to do the final selection of one, possibly two options that we'll get much more detail in. So as I go through this, we can discuss that. And we're asking the advisory committee if you might be able to give us some, thoughts and input, probably by the end of next week, and then we'll start to move forward on that. So let me get into that. So at our last meeting, the last presentation, we talked about, and at the public workshop, we talked about all these different, this matrix of adaptation options that we've been looking at to address heat and to flood. We've come up with like a dozen of them, and they range from adaptation options that address heat all the way through flooding and also for safety. When in this matrix, we have divided this into on the left, things that are much more structural, all the way to the right, which are much more non-structural. And we've started to apply it and looked at where we think some of these adaptation options can be used throughout the study area. So the map that you see on the left coincides with the matrix. So this is kind of the focus of today. We've taken all the dozen of these different options, and we've refined it to about 5. And this is really looking at the focus of the study. So let me just kind of go through those. The first is looking at inclusion of a resilience center. You currently have the South Norwalk Elementary School that's going through planning and zoning. And so one option is to work with the team that's putting that together and consider having that be designed so that it would also be a resilience center. So we would look at guidelines that could be created, not only for that, but also for future developments or renovated existing facilities to change them for to support the community for in flood and heat situations. The second adaptation.
I'm sorry to interrupt, but can you
Sure.
tell me what a resilience center is?
So it's like you currently in the city of south of Norwalk, you have cooling centers
Yeah, like in the high
that are
school.
designated. Yeah, so you have the I think some of the library is one, and the I think the police station is another. And so this would be another one of those. But
Oh, sorry.
So a place for people to go in the event of storms, essentially.
yes,
Okay.
yes.
Okay, but I would just say, if you're looking at it as an overnight shelter, we would just would have to, again, probably be a little bit careful with, the size, the location. Obviously it can't be within a flood zone. That's one of the bigger issues. Again, we can have conversations about cooling and warming centers. We do tend to open them in like public spaces and avoid schools, just because if schools are in session, you don't want members of the public really interacting and coming into a school building. So unless it's, again, maybe on a weekend or evening after hours, but then again, you do run into some other issues versus public buildings like libraries, which are staffed by city employees and maybe open a little bit later. So again, I would like to have maybe some future conversation about that. Just from the emergency management piece of, again, sheltering for overnight, and again, some of the limitations and what our specific needs are around those.
Okay, no, I appreciate that. Thank you. So the second option that we are looking at as an alternative is the looking at elevating some roadways. Again, that's, what if we look at this in a little more detail, we would be looking at establishing possibly locations where there's more chronic flooding. looking at different options for the depth of the, or the level of the elevation. There are lots of pros and cons to that. Incorporating green infrastructure with curb bump outs. That it would have the advantage of being able to increase street trees, looking at stormwater, incorporating the green infrastructure within the curb bump outs. Also developing resilience overlay districts. I know that currently you have quite a number of things that are being developed in the for planning within the city, and it may be fairly timely to consider a resilience overlay district. And then the last of the list on 5 is updating stormwater system, existing stormwater system. As we had presented earlier, there were 2 locations of which there were some outflow pipes that were undersized. So this is the first one is the idea of a resiliency center. And as you mentioned earlier, that, you know, if we looked at this, we'd have to consider if the school would be appropriate for that. And if so, what would be have to be included in the design of the school currently. We just looked at the plans that were submitted a few weeks ago. And we could, you know, again, these are all things that we would decide to look into more detail. Elevating the roadway we would look at similar to what was done at the intersection of Raymond and Day Street. We'll be looking at a little more detail at other locations to address some of the areas that are flooded, like Water Street and the lower part of Woodward Street. Incorporating the green infrastructure within curb bump outs, incorporating things like permeable paving, and again, adding street trees to help alleviate some of the heat, high heat areas, such as within Woodward Street and again on Concord Street. This is an aerial view of some of the of one of the locations that we had presented. Just as a reminder, this is the Burritt Street intersection. So one thought is that if we looked at having some elevation of Water Street at the lower southern port of that, and then turned and had a connection on Concord Street to South Main. Once we did all the analysis of where the flooding was, looked like we could elevate this small portion and be able to have an access way between Quintaro and all the way to South Main without being in flood conditions. And we could also incorporate some of the green infrastructure and bump outs on Concord Street to start to develop this street as being more of a connection to downtown. The other location that we had presented as possibility for elevation, and we spoke of last time, was the elevation of the lower part of Woodward Avenue. This is between Sable Street and to the north, just above where the warehouse areas are. Obviously, this would need to have a wider right-of-way, and there would be green space that would be designed on either side for connections to on some of the side roads, Neptune Street and Beryl Street, but there would be room to do grading on both sides, as well as on the west side. being able to grade to these connections to the driveways. The next option that we were looking at was having a resiliency overlay district that would include both flooding and heat as guidelines for any development, for future developments, or even as guidelines and reference for development within that zone. There have been a number of cities on the East Coast that have done something similar. Norfolk, Virginia, and Boston have some good examples. We could take a look at creating some guidelines and get a start on putting together an overlay district for resiliency. And then the last option is updating the stormwater system, as we mentioned at the earlier presentation. We did do a quick analysis and looked at the existing drainage stormwater management system and located 2 locations, of which the outflow pipes were undersized, and that just contributes, of course, to flooding upland. So that would be another option. So we can sort of open this up to questions. Our team is here. If we want to talk about any of those 5 options and see if there are any other questions, I can go back to the first one for the school. And we've got, 40 minutes to kind of go through here and get some feedback from anybody. If any of these seem like they'd be viable or priorities for the city to have more detail for the report.
I mean, I think there are some other worthy projects that probably could benefit from this. Again, the identification of schools. Again, we have relationships with the Norwalk public school system. So if we did have to stand something up quickly, we could. But again, we do have our pre-designated shelters for overnight sheltering. We have our cooling centers, warming centers, as needed, identified. Again, kind of trying to stay away from the schools. So I don't necessarily see this as something we'd want to focus on. There may be some benefit, possibly even like working at the library, maybe South Norwalk Library. Maybe we do set up an area, like a permanent display or working space where residents can come in and learn about mitigation, resilience, some of the toolkits that are available, maybe make a little resilience station in the library. That may be a benefit because then it brings together all the resources, handouts, again, maybe some of the easy toolkits to help people versus doing something really within a school, if that makes sense.
Okay. Does anyone else have any thoughts on this option for resiliency centers?
Is there a way generally to get a sense of like which one of the impact that you think these options are going to have, or just to get a sense of like what you think is most valuable to go after, like what's going to have the biggest benefit or highest ROI, or any sort of way of just getting a sense of like, if you have to just do one of these, you probably want to do this one above the other ones. Does any of those sort of stand out in any particular way?
We've been going back and forth with that, where we are starting to do a cost benefit analysis to also look at that aspect of it. Once we get a little more targeted. I know that it's, when we were talking earlier with the circuit team, we're, hoping that the option that we choose is something that could be really doable and get started within this next year, as far as, going for funding and such. So they, certainly the resiliency center and some of the infrastructure updates could be done pretty quickly without a lot of other would compared to, for example, the elevation of roadways, which would take a lot of coordination and a lot of engineering and design. So
That's super
near
helpful.
term, long
Yeah, no,
term.
that's super helpful. Just trying to get a sense of like, at the end, we can't do everything. So to get a sense of like what's most
Right.
valuable to do.
Yeah, and but certainly the roadway elevation is impactful. I mean, we've all looked at these maps, for a number of these meetings and see that, the connection between the lower part of Woodward and all the way up through is it's a
But that could be the
challenge.
answer, right? Like that could be the answer at the end. Like the most impactful thing is that roadway improvement, and that's where you want to spend effort, even though it may be most expensive to do as well, but it still may have the ultimate benefit there. So
Yeah,
that makes a
or
lot of sense.
pieces of it, looking
Right.
at pieces of it that eventually would, once they're stitched together, end up with a continuation, in this figure, as you can see, if the lower part of Woodward was elevated, there's a way of connecting through up to Kotaro, up to Burt Street, and then that would connect to the northern part. So, then all of a sudden you have a full continuation up to South Main, which is your goal.
So apologies if you've talked about this, but are you intending to suggest one of those options, or is this an either or type of thing?
Yeah, we're gonna present and have in the report, all of these options will be included to some level of detail, but we're kind of gonna do a dive into like one of them, depending on the scale of them, like one, maybe two of them with much more detail.
It seems like the school is a very different scale than the road, right? I mean, quite different. And also it seems to me the school, and I know you've discussed this, but if I was going to have a bigger, I think that personally, I think the road improvements or the other items you mentioned would have a greater impact on this community than that would a cooling center. But anyway, I know there's a lot of money difference too, monetary.
Can I ask a question about the cooling center? Idea is the idea there that if there's been a huge flood event and power is out, that these places would have air conditioning? Is that the idea, or?
Yes, and I also I did notice when I looked at the plans that they are planning to have solar on the roof of the school, and that would certainly be one of solar and batteries would be certainly part of with the recommendation of the guidelines for these cooling centers.
But we also do work with Eversource, because both Norwalk High School and Brian McMahon are the identified shelters, and then obviously the libraries, police station, city hall. Again, those are kind of priority areas. So again, part of that whole critical infrastructure piece. So again, if we are using them as a shelter, where we can say, all right, we need to make sure they do have power. They're already on generators. So that restoration is a priority, regardless of, again, whether it's a cooling center, shelter, whatever else. But again, typically we try to avoid doing any cooling or warming centers in schools, especially nowadays. And you don't want the public coming into a school when school is in session. So unless school is going to be canceled due to a hot day,
Mhm.
or a cold day,
Right, or flooding.
you kind of limit the use. And we do have the malls, movie theaters. We encourage folks to go to friends, families, senior centers. We could always identify additional buildings, but I would really, again, stay away from a school just because of that interaction between the public and kids. And I think the school would probably echo the same sentiment.
Lorraine, maybe I can just jump in. This is Jeffrey from AECOM. Just trying to help get a little more feedback from this group. I think what's been frankly kind of rewarding about looking at South Norwalk and understanding how the whole set of neighborhoods and the existing physical features present some opportunities and challenges. I think what we've learned from the study is that there's a lot of different things that can happen over time to make the area more resilient, both from a heat perspective, from a kind of stormwater perspective, from a flood inundation perspective. And I think if I'm understanding you right, Lorraine, that part of what you'd like to get from this group is if knowing that all of those things are important to make the whole area become more resilient, are there certain things during this process that kind of rose to the top of like, wow, if we could just do those couple of things, it would start the city down a path towards implementing these things over time to do all of the things on that list too. So while the school / resiliency center is one of them that deals with heat and cooling effects, the roadways deal with flooding effects and so forth. So realizing that trying to fix different parts or address different parts of the issues that came to light. So just be curious, whether it's heating, cooling, resiliency center, flooding, if you can only start with 2 or 3 projects, like where would it be the most impact, independent of cost, that maybe we can do a little bit more homework as a team to come back with you to talk about how the cost benefit works out, because there's so many things that I think we came across. It's almost like you got to start to figure out where you'd like to start first as part of it. So I wasn't sure if the committee felt like, wow, we learned a lot and here are those top 2 or 3 things. That's, I think, what Lorraine's trying to get from this group of initial observations, so we can go and study it a little bit more and come back and try to validate a few more things. So
Thanks.
I can add a little bit to that. Vanessa Valadares, Chief of Operations and Public Works. I think that a lot of the ideas that came out of this study is very good. I think that some of them, maybe you guys thought out of the box. What it is good that give us that mindset on things that we should consider. I just have a little bit of concerns about it that we can implement that. So to be very honest, again, there are a couple of things that I'm concerned. So I believe that when we did that proposal at Woodward Avenue last time, I think that although it is a good idea, I'm not sure how feasible we can make it happen. I do not know what will be the cost to really acquire all that private property. And at the same time, if we elevate that stretch, there will be a huge impact on the other side streets. And what will be the impact on that? What will be the cost associated to move everyone's driveway and up to where we need to regrade to make sure that we are not even bringing more water to those properties. So I think as a concept idea, it is good. My concern is that when we show this to the public, I'm afraid that may create some expectations to them that unfortunately, when we move to full design, we cannot achieve.
Well, and one thing that internally we had thought about also is, the idea of, again, sort of looking at small bits of this. If if there was a way to even do a small bit of elevation at this northern section through here that would then be able to connect people to get up and over this hill, that's a smaller project. So it's if we took a look at this, we could look at it in little bits versus one grand design. to see if there were, small sections like Burritt Street intersection and Water Street, is that a project that if DOT and the city were interested in, having that on the list for improvements when they do it, is that a place that there should be some elevation considered for grades here? Because then it's, again, to what we had spoken about, then it starts to knit together this link. And I think that's like looking at the wider aspect of it. If you know that, there's a master plan idea that you want to be able to get Harbor Shores and this community up and over it, even, during nuisance flooding and then maybe even the most extreme flooding.
I was thinking along the same lines. I think maybe to your point that there's like this conceptual kind of overarching plan to have this resilient corridor for access purposes. But then within that master scheme, there are different breakout points, like the intersections you just talked about. Maybe those are more feasible from a design and funding standpoint. And then to Vanessa's point, the Woodward Avenue is like a longer term concept the city has to study in detail. And then maybe that's a separate project where they, step one is to look at A, feasibility even more closely and the impacts, and then B, look at construction costs and go from there. So that could be like a 10-year window, whereas like some of the intersection improvements could happen in a quicker time frame.
Well, I'll also point out that we leave Harbor View high and dry, or not high and dry, because they will be completely inundated and a good half a mile from your egress corridor here. And actually, after you get Sable, then it's Yost, and then after Yost, it's a long stretch without any frontage properties. You go sort of on a semi-causeway across the marsh with the access to the old power plant, and then you get the Harbor View. So the whole rest of that black line would also, if you're, I lived in Village Creek, so I'd be happy to be able to get out of Village Creek, but you've left Harbor View completely out of it. And perhaps the whole thing here is, what you need an egress corridor here for is, well, an emergency evacuation. Most coastal towns have hurricane evacuation routes, which I believe like Gregory Boulevard is signed for. But it's also for access for emergency vehicles in case of flooding. And that perhaps has to be an operational thing. And does the fire department have a Humvee type of vehicle that can go through 6 feet of water to be able to evacuate people in an emergency if somebody has a heart attack in Harbor View during a flood event that you can't get regular vehicles in. That's an operational solution and is probably cheaper than building a causeway. But and so my other question would be then, how far are you exploring this in this study? Like, so for example, the Concord section and the Water Street section, are you looking at how many properties are impacted, how many driveways are impacted, how many structure entrances would be impacted by, 2-foot raise and 2 or 3 foot raise of whatever you're proposing?
Well, we've already started doing that in just a very, very preliminary way. This is, again, it's very, a planning document. But we've already started, setting it up, knowing how many, again, driveways and roadways and impacts it would be. And then the question is whether or not your elevation is designed for just a 2-foot change, so that it would be, for more, well, I said, like nuisance flooding versus doing 4-foot, which would be the 2050 elevation change for maximum 2050. So
yeah, so when we talked last time, you guys stated that you're planning for the 2050 sea level rise to elevation 10.88, which is, so the FEMA flood the FEMA flood elevation for South Norwalk, for that section of South Norwalk, and it varies across town, that elevation is 12. So we're not even planning for the FEMA 100-year storm.
No, we're doing the 10.88, which is the state's.
Well,
Well,
why wouldn't we use the federal, which is more conservative?
Hey, Chris, this is John from Circa.
Yep.
So what we, as part of this project, we actually developed a flood model specific for this area in South Norwalk. So essentially the results of our flood model is that the FEMA elevations are biased too high. And there's a number of different factors that go into that, which, you know, be happy to connect you with our flood modelers at some point if you want to get into the details. So, but we're not talking about elevations of buildings, which, you know, have to use the FEMA elevations.
Well,
So we're talking about the elevations of the roads. So I think
right.
the Circa flood model is a much more accurate prediction of the types of storms that impact Norwalk.
Right.
And so that's why we've used that. If we were to use the FEMA elevations, then we would need to go higher on some of these. And
Right.
so, and I
fair enough.
think
So-
just to make one final point is,
Sure.
you know, I think we need to sort of differentiate between, I think what we're starting to zero in on is that there's some areas of the neighborhoods in South Norwalk that are already experiencing chronic flooding and tidal flooding. And so I
Yes.
think we want to present recommendations for, here's the areas that are going to have this sort of chronic flooding problem in the future, and here's how high you would need to elevate them to address that. And then you can also have the higher elevations, which would be for you know, an extreme storm like a Category 3, something like that. So we can present both of those options in terms of the road elevations.
Right. Yep. So, and the building code is base flood plus 1. So the
Right.
building code would require 13 feet in those areas. You know, and the waterfront area has another 2 feet on top of that because of wave action. So that, you know, there's a lot going on there. And then as long as I have the floor, the other thing we discussed, well, you guys didn't propose any berm area, so I'm curious if you have any ideas about that. But then the other thing is the drainage system. Now, the issue with flooding is not rain related in terms of getting rainfall out of the zones. It's preventing Long Island Sound from entering the zones. And I think the most important thing we could do certainly to prevent the nuisance flooding is to put backflow preventers on all the outfalls from any of these areas, because it is backflow through the drain system that bubbles up onto Water Street, which you will see, you know, at a lot of high moon, high tides, certainly half a dozen a year at all the king tides each year.
okay.
We've just gone through a cycle of that last month.
We did that in the past, unfortunately didn't work, installing all of that.
Well, and that's a good segue. I was going to say that we have Susan Bemis is on the call, and I know we've kind of quickly went through this with green infrastructure, and we had considered doing these curb bump outs on the upper portion of Woodward and on Meadow Street to kind of reinforce and improve both of those roadways for pedestrians and bikes, and be able to address some of the stormwater. And I might just kind of turn this over to her to kind of talk a little bit about this design, so we kind of give enough time for each one of these. Oops.
Sure, thanks, Lorraine. Hi.
Okay, thank you. So I can't see everyone, so.
No problem. And Chris Henry is here with me as well. And so I think we'll sort of chime in together, but this part of the kit of parts is really trying to capture some co-benefits. Green infrastructure, as I'm sure you know, can help with runoff, but it can also help with, water quality. And these examples that we're showing can help with heat island mitigation and just providing more green and less pavement to provide a cooler walking and pedestrian experience. And then also can help with traffic calming and can really try to work with some other existing planning that's going on to sort of find a way towards implementation. And these can be a little bit shorter term timeline implementation versus the street elevations that we were just talking about. I don't know, Chris, you have anything you want to add?
Sure. Yeah, we were fortunate at FHI Studio to help the city put together the transportation master plan that was completed recently, and we're working on a related complete streets plan at the moment. And a big theme of both efforts really, but particularly the master plan, is this interconnectivity between projects like this. This is a perfect case in point where, as Susan said, things like curb extensions or bump outs or relatively small scale interventions from a resiliency standpoint can be 100% compatible with other stated needs and goals that we heard both from the public as well as stakeholders in neighborhoods, excuse me, like South Norwalk. That really the intent is to make sure that as any one potential project starts to take shape, it's folding in all of these opportunities. So if, for example, the transportation department has a street project and they're looking at traffic calming, well, let's make sure that's taking into account, the resiliency approaches, the cooling, the materials and green infrastructure, and vice versa, as we're looking at some of these potential street interventions that, in this context are very much focused on flooding and resiliency and adaptation. These are calling out exact interventions, that emerged in the transportation master plan and that fit very well in the city's ongoing effort to calm streets, to make certain neighborhoods more walkable, more accessible, and so forth.
But did these things impact in the way that Chris was saying, or like preventing flooding coming from the sound at all? Because it seems like this is only going to help with rainfall to a degree, even versus flooding, the real flooding, where the real flooding's happening, if I'm understanding correctly.
Yeah,
Well, right. I mean, if we're looking at, an intersection scale intervention, a curb extension or something like that, particularly like from a transportation perspective, that is a very localized, effort that's not going to solve the coastal flooding issue. That said, anything that helps mitigate, stormwater runoff, helps with water retention, so forth, is a net gain. And I think that gets back to the point that was made about, the extent to which you tackle all of Woodward Avenue as a project versus start to put into effect some, spot interventions that are still working you towards the larger goal that might take more time, study and planning. So a lot of these things are very compatible short term, just to say that, with other projects and other initiatives the city might be undertaking, now or in the near future. But having these projects talk together is really critical.
And this does fold into looking at this green line here. This is the Upper Woodward and Meadow Street. It does also address some of the key issues within those corridors, especially with the addition of the elementary school. And again, as we had said, being able to have areas that we can locate street trees. The impact to the community, of course, is that if we did this, we would have to, the idea of having parallel parking on both of those sections of the roadway would be impacted. So it's weighing that. Currently, there's quite a lot of on-street parking. But there's also been comments about, too much traffic, and fast traffic. So, as Susan said, it's a traffic calming. So making it a resilient corridor and kind of hitting all those goals and all those guidelines would be.
Well, Lorraine, I wonder if there's, having heard the group talk about a range of potential projects and priorities and what are we solving for? Is it heat? Is it rain? Is it flood? Maybe there's a way that we can go back and think about choices on priority projects by thinking about what it's solving for. So for example, everything in the red is really about solving for a corridor that would be a resilient corridor that would help with things like nuanced flooding, evacuation, emergency, and so forth, and attacking that line over time as a series of projects would be helpful to think about. And one could argue if you attack it from the south and work your way north, in a major event, you can still never get out. So maybe there's a logic about, figuring out how we can attack something like that red line from the north, heading south, see if there are projects that could be, as Stephen mentioned, intersection level ones that you can do now versus segments that need further study to work with property owners. And there's kind of a strategy around the corridor pieces. And then maybe separately, there's an idea around heat and cooling centers that are other projects. All of them are important, but maybe there's priorities about the heat and cooling projects that are a different category of projects that might be standalone projects and might be working with different departments, that maybe there's a couple of projects that come out from there. So then there's a little bit of a playbook about how you'd attack if you're solving for heat and cooling. There's a playbook if you're starting to attack for flooding, and then some logic behind it where it's like things like starting north and going south, or starting at key intersections and then having the time to study the segments along the way. So maybe we can provide a little bit of that framework about why you'd rank them and why you'd start with certain areas first, then follow with one second. So I just wanted to offer that up as hearing this group talk, the idea of having an organizational aspect to why you'd pick some, and knowing that you're heading towards a long-term goal seems kind of important as I've heard people talk about these. That's all. And
Do we know
hopefully
people would have to be evacuated? Oh, sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. Go ahead, Louise.
Oh, I just was wondering if there's a number of people that would need to be evacuated if from that picture, if everyone had flooded that was in that picture and had lost their power and needed to get out, like how many people are we talking about?
Yeah, I don't think we know that number yet, but we could get that number through some of the census data.
Okay, thanks.
I'd say to 300 to 400 households
Okay.
are on the peninsula that's Woodward Avenue. Village Creek's 70, Harbor View's a little over 100, I would think. I think Shorefront Park or Harbor Shores is around that. That's a ballpark guess just from having lived in that area.
I'm going to pop in for 1 second if you guys can hear me, and I'll put my hand back down. Jeffrey, you stole the words right out of my mouth. I wanted to just sort of give a reminder that what you said is really consistent with this funding program. So Resilient Connecticut is about finding resilient hubs, resilient corridors in Fairfield and New Haven counties and addressing flooding and extreme heat. So you hit the nail on the head with your reminder that it might be a good idea to think about the corridors that you just mentioned, and also the ways to cool people off, cooling center or otherwise. And I just wanted to thank you for sort of popping in there with that reminder. I think it's important that we also remember that Resilient Connecticut is meant to move projects onto the state's resilient project pipeline, which we don't talk a lot about in these meetings, but we can pull different things onto the project pipeline for the state at different times. That's the way that it's designed. So if something comes out of this and is moved towards the state's project pipeline now, but something else is deferred till next year, that's okay. So these are kind of a little bit of a low risk decision points that we can make, because we don't have to get it exactly right this time. There'll be chances to go back in and move other things to the state's project pipeline. That's it.
Thank you, David. All right. Thoughts? Well, we talked about the stormwater system in relation to the piping and the and backflow. Do we want to have any comments or anyone have any thoughts about the overlay zoning district?
I'd love to see some language if you have it. I think where we're at, I'm not sure exact when you guys are going to be, report complete kind of thing, but worst case for us is if the regulations get, voted on and approved at a certain date in the fall, and we don't have anything fleshed out yet, or I'm not sure if you're going to have, because a lot of times the way these kind of plans go is they have some guidance in terms of what those regulations are, or point to models of what they could look like, but then we still have to go in and actually
Right.
fit the language for us and massage it quite a bit. So my guess is that 6 months post adoption of the new regulations, we're probably going to have a kind of couple different workshops where we go through things that just need to get cleaned up or aren't working as we expected or something like that. So even if this plan gets adopted, and that's one of the items that comes out of it, which I think is would have a lot of merit for us. It doesn't mean we have to act on it right now. We have an opportunity to incorporate that 6 months, 12 months down the road after the new zoning is adopted.
Yeah, so just so everyone knows, we're looking at October for the completion of the final report. We're planning to have another public workshop in September. And we'll get, we'll be able to present sort of the draft final report at that point. So in the next month or so, we're hoping to get, most of the final report done. Or in good shape. Gives a little bit of an idea. And just also as a reminder, as we had said, is, all these things that we're talking about are all going to be in the report. It's just, it's just going into a little more detail on one or maybe two things. So Steve will have, I've started looking at Norfolk, I've started looking at the Boston stuff, and there certainly have links, and I've pulled out a couple things that seem like it fits, but that's just very preliminary.
And I do like the idea of the, again, a resilient Norwalk project. And again, I've been a member kind of like Resilient Miami. There's a lot of, again, larger cities that do have, again, ongoing meetings, discussions, projects about this. I would just think about, again, I know we are focused on a very narrow corridor, but we are still a smallish city. So I wonder if if we're going to say a resilient Norwalk project, then try to be more inclusive of the city as a whole, especially with heat emergencies. Again, there's different pockets of the city that are equally impacted by heat, again, flooding issues, and again, other areas that are along the coast, East Norwalk, Rowayton. Again, I get that we're focused solely in South Norwalk, but I just wonder if we would be limiting ourselves too much if we have these opportunities.
Well, and one thing, Michelle, with the certainly all of the recommendations are transferable that we'll have included. I mean, we are just looking at this one space, but any of these could also the information that's in the report could be used in other locations.
Yeah, because I just think, again, for a lot of us, like, we're planning for the city as a whole. And again, we are small. So again, the difference between East Norwalk, South Norwalk, again, going into Rowayton, is all the same coast. So I just kind of want that awareness of, how all these projects fit in with a larger vision of what we're planning for.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and indicative of planning at different scales, neighborhood scale, city scale, regional scale, statewide scale. And back to the idea of trying to zoom in, learn about nuances, because it's hard to plan strategies at a too big of a scale. But I hear you totally. Like, this is not the only neighborhood within Norwalk, within all of the East Coast communities, especially within Connecticut, have these same problems. But I think zooming in and learning from it, and to Lorraine's point, trying to see what's transferable, applicable, and zoom back out. But I think what's kind of interesting about where we are as a kind of planning world is starting to plan for these things and implement them. And there's not a lot of history on how to actually do it over time. So we're kind of creating a path forward as we're doing this, but totally understand and agree. It's a broad-based problem, but trying to start at the local level is, I think, what this project's trying to at least learn from.
Well, and we all appreciate all your comments. And, anything that also comes up between, now or, hopefully by next week, but, certainly beyond that is also welcome. But it gives us a little bit more direction, more things to think about as we start to finalize these concepts. We're looking at probably around the 18th of August to finish this phase and then go right into the next month, having that final draft report done middle of September. And as I mentioned, we have a tentative September 21st date for our next public workshop. We're hoping it will be in person. We've done 2 virtuals so far, but we may try to do in person, which would be a great option, a great alternative. And that the final report and executive summary would be ready for, would be finalized and ready for the city at the end of October. So I don't know if anyone has any other, this is schedule, which just reflects what I just mentioned. And I think Michelle, you can send all of this to, we'll get it over to you. You can send it to all the committee members. And we have the final technical memorandum for the current and future conditions set. So we have a number of pieces of this that we can provide you.
Yeah, can do.
Yeah, and just to follow up on Lorraine's summary. So, we'll have a number of different recommendations that we'll put into the final report for this project. And, I think there's an opportunity for our team to do a little deeper dive on 1 or 2 of the options that you've heard about. And we're trying to weigh, going back to Nick's question, we're sort of trying to weigh the impact of the option, which could become a project, versus things that we could help to move forward in the next 12 months. And we're really thinking about, David's comments about the resilience project pipeline. Which of these could we set up for funding support for the city, which could fit into some of the resilience grant programs that are out there. So that's sort of what we need feedback on. And if you have any additional feedback, or thoughts, please share it with us, and then we'll go from there.
Thank you, John. Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. Thank you, Michelle, for setting this up.
Sure. Thanks for everybody for joining.
Can we
you.
can we get a copy of this presentation to orient our comments to?
Yes.
Absolutely. Okay. Thank you.